Intel wasn't just another tech company. It was the tech industry. Intel was untouchable. We're talking about a company that owned the computer chip market, with over 80% of all PCs powered by Intel. If you had a desktop, if you had a laptop, odds were it had that little blue Intel Inside sticker right on it. From powering the world's earliest PCs to dominating the chip market, they were untouchable. But today, the story's very different. That same giant is stumbling, bleeding market share and watching rivals like AMD, Apple, and TSMC run circles around it. How does the company that once powered almost every computer on the planet, the same giant that put the famous Intel Inside sticker on millions of laptops, is now struggling to even stand the game? Well, this isn't just another big company fumbled the bag story. This is a roller coaster of missed opportunities, brutal competition, and decisions so costly that they may have changed the entire future of technology. And trust me, once you see how Intel went from undisputed king to underdog fighting for survival, you'll never look at your laptop or smartphone the same way again.
Before we talk about Intel's downfall, we've got to understand how big their rise actually was. Because this isn't just some random company slipping up. This is the giant that practically built modern computing. Intel's story starts back in 1968, when two guys, Robert Moyse and Gordon Moore, walked out of Fairchild Semiconductor to start their own company. Yep, that's the same Gordon Moore behind Moore's Law, the idea that chips would double in power roughly every 2 years. And for decades, Intel actually made that prediction come true. In 1971, they dropped the world's first commercial microprocessor, the Intel 4004. That was the spark that lit the digital revolution. Fast forward to the 80s and 90s, Intel chips weren't just powering computers, they were computers. From IBM PCs to early Microsoft Windows machines, everything ran on Intel. And here's the genius move. Intel didn't just focus on tech, they went mainstream with marketing. Remember that little Intel Inside sticker? It wasn't just branding, it made consumers actually ask for Intel by name, even if they didn't know what a CPU was. Suddenly, Intel wasn't just a parts supplier, it was a household name. By the 2000s, their dominance was insane. At one point, they were making nearly 90% of the world's PC processors. Think about that. Almost every desktop in offices, schools, and homes worldwide had Intel at its core. If you used a computer in the 90s or 2000s, chances are you were using Intel without even realizing it. Now, let's pause for a second, because before the fall, Intel hit heights most companies can only dream of. In the late 90s and 2000s, Intel wasn't just leading the chip industry, they were the chip industry. Their processors powered everything from personal computers to giant corporate servers. And because of Moore's Law, every couple of years, Intel would roll out a new generation of CPUs that made the last one look ancient. People actually expected their computers to get twice as fast every time they upgraded, and Intel delivered. The numbers back it up. In 2011, Intel pulled in around $54 billion in revenue, with a profit margin other companies could only envy. At their peak, they controlled about 80 to 90% of the global PC CPU market. That's not dominance, that's a monopoly in all but name. And let's not forget, Intel wasn't just a supplier, they were a brand. That famous 4-note Intel Inside jingle became part of pop culture. It got to the point where buying a computer without an Intel sticker felt like a downgrade. On the manufacturing side, they were years ahead of rivals. Their fabs, the factories that actually make chips, were the envy of the industry. Other companies like AMD had to design chips and then outsource manufacturing. But Intel, they did it all in-house.
that gave them control, speed, and reliability that others just couldn't match. So at this point in the story, Intel looked untouchable, like the king who would rule forever. Nobody, and I mean nobody, thought this empire could crumble.
Here's where things started to go wrong. And the crazy part is, the warning signs were there all along. Back in the mid-2000s, Intel had a chance to grab hold of what would become the biggest tech shift of our time: smartphones. In fact, Apple's Steve Jobs actually approached Intel about making processors for the first iPhone. That's right, the iPhone could have been powered by Intel, but Intel turned it down. They thought the chips wouldn't be profitable enough and didn't believe smartphones would replace PCs. Instead, Apple went with ARM-based designs, and the rest is history. ARM went on to power billions of devices, while Intel was stuck on the sidelines. But that wasn't their only misstep. Around the same time, Intel also underestimated the rise of graphics processing. NVIDIA was quietly building GPUs that weren't just for video games, they were about to power the AI and data revolution. Intel had the resources to compete in this space, but they dragged their feet, treating GPUs like a side project instead of a gold mine. And then there was the obsession with PCs. Intel doubled down on desktops and laptops just as the world was shifting toward mobile, cloud, and low-power computing. They bet on the old game while the new one was being written right in front of them. Looking back, these moments feel almost unbelievable. A company this smart, this powerful, missing the smartphone wave, ignoring GPUs, and clinging to the PC market? But that's exactly what happened. And these early mistakes planted the seeds of the decline we're about to see play out.
If there was one area where Intel had always been untouchable, it was manufacturing. For decades, they led the world in shrinking transistors and making chips faster, smaller, and more efficient. But around the mid-2010s, the unthinkable happened. Intel stumbled. Here's the story. In 2014, Intel promised its next big leap, 10-nanometer chips, would arrive by 2016. Smaller transistors meant more performance, less power, and a huge edge over rivals. But 2016 came and went, then 2017, then 2018. By the time Intel finally shipped a proper 10-nanometer product in 2019, they were 3 years late. In the chip industry, 3 years is a lifetime. This delay was mainly due to overly ambitious design goals, as admitted by some of Intel's executives. According to Intel's then CEO, Robert Holmes Swan, at a time when manufacturing was getting harder and harder, we set increasingly aggressive targets. Also, the then Intel's chief engineering officer, Dr. Murthy Renduchintala, our targets required a tremendous amount of process and technology innovation, many revolutionary experiments to be brought together at the time that we thought were bounded and calibrated, but ultimately, when we put all of that chemistry together, we clearly underestimated the challenge ahead of us. Intel set unrealistic goals and prioritized performance at a time when predictability was really important, and this cost them. Meanwhile, TSMC, a company that used to follow Intel's lead, surged ahead. In 2018, TSMC delivered 7-nanometer chips for Apple's iPhones and AMD's new Ryzen processors. Think about that. Intel was stuck trying to fix 10 nanometers while their competitors were already selling faster, more efficient 7-nanometer products to millions of customers. And it didn't stop there. Intel's roadmap kept slipping. Their 7-nanometer process, which was supposed to debut around 2021, got delayed all the way to 2023, then rebranded as Intel 4. It was like watching a sprinter trip at the starting line while rivals lap them again and again. These delays gave Intel's reputation a blow. Customers like Apple started to find ways of designing their own chips.
AMD, fapped by TSMC, started clawing back desktop market share, and suddenly, the company that once led the entire semiconductor race was behind.
While Intel was tripping over its manufacturing problems, something incredible was happening. The companies that used to live in its shadow started rising. Take AMD, for example. For most of the 2000s, AMD was basically the scrappy underdog. Good ideas, but always crushed by Intel's marketing and superior manufacturing. But then came 2017. AMD launched its Ryzen processors built on TSMC's advanced 7nm technology. And suddenly, they were not just competing, they were beating Intel in performance, efficiency, and price. Gamers started switching, PC enthusiasts started switching. By 2020, AMD went from under 20% desktop CPU market share to nearly 40%. That's insane growth. And then there's Apple. For years, Apple used Intel chips in its MacBooks, but delays with Intel's processors frustrated them. Their laptops ran hot, battery life was weak, and innovation was stalled. So in 2020, Apple dropped a bombshell. They were ditching Intel and building their own chips, the Apple Silicon M1. And when the M1 launched, reviewers couldn't believe it. Faster performance, cooler, longer battery life, all in the first generation. Apple proved that Intel wasn't just behind TSMC, they were behind in innovation too. And don't forget NVIDIA. While Intel struggled with CPUs, NVIDIA was dominating the GPU market and pushing into AI computing. By the late 2010s, all the big breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, from self-driving cars to ChatGPT-style models, were running on NVIDIA GPUs. Intel tried to play catch-up with acquisitions like Nirvana and Habana Labs, but it was too little too late. NVIDIA was miles ahead, and Wall Street knew it. NVIDIA's market cap skyrocketed, while Intel's started to shrink. So now, the picture looked very different. Instead of Intel leading and everyone else chasing, Intel was on the defensive. AMD was eating their lunch in CPUs, Apple abandoned them entirely, NVIDIA was stealing the spotlight in AI and data centers. The rivals Intel used to brush off as smaller players, they had turned into giants themselves.
You can blame technology and rivals all day long, but sometimes companies don't decline just because of outside forces. They decline because of what's happening inside. And for Intel, leadership and culture were a huge part of the problem. Intel was once run by legendary leaders like Andy Grove, a man famous for his mantra, "Only the paranoid survive." He fostered a culture of innovation, speed, and execution. That mindset turned Intel into a powerhouse. But after Grove, the leadership baton wasn't passed with the same fire. When Paul Otellini was CEO, Intel missed the smartphone wave. Remember when Apple came knocking about the iPhone? That decision to say no happened under his watch. After him came Brian Krzanich, who became CEO in 2013. Krzanich was more of an operations guy than a visionary. And during his tenure, Intel's 10nm manufacturing delays exploded into a crisis. And it wasn't just about one leader. Intel's culture itself shifted. Instead of being paranoid about the future, Intel became arrogant about its past. Engineers inside the company often complained that innovation was being stifled by layers of bureaucracy. Decision-making slowed down. Risk-taking dried up. Raja Koduri, former Intel chief architect, talks about the bureaucracy. The spreadsheet and PowerPoint snakes, bureaucratic processes that dominate corporate decision-making, often fail to grasp the true cost of surrendering performance leadership. They optimize for minimizing quarterly losses while missing the bigger picture. His statement was about how engineers feel constrained by management overhead, which reduce their ability to execute boldly. Imagine being a young engineer with a bold idea, only to have it killed in endless meetings. That became the Intel way. Meanwhile, rivals like AMD, NVIDIA, and Apple fostered leaner, faster, more experimental cultures. They encouraged risk, and when bets paid off, like AMD's Ryzen or Apple's M1, they reaped massive rewards. Intel, on the other hand, became a place where playing it safe was the norm. By the time Pat Gelsinger returned as CEO in 2021, Intel wasn't just fighting a technological battle, it was fighting a cultural one. He even admitted in interviews that Intel must shake up its sleepy corporate culture, refocus on core engineering, and you could see it in the results. While other competitors were making 7nm and even 4nm chips, Intel was issuing apology after apology for delays and missteps. So yes, manufacturing problems hurt, but behind those problems were leadership miscalculations and a culture that forgot Grove's golden rule. Perennia keeps you alive. Once that perennia was gone, complacency took its place, and Intel started bleeding from the inside out. Even if Intel had perfect leadership and flawless execution, they were walking into a storm. The global tech landscape was changing, and Intel suddenly found itself squeezed from all directions. First, there's TSMC, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company. Unlike Intel, which tried to do both design and manufacturing, TSMC specialized in just one thing: making chips for other people. That focus turned them into the world's most advanced chip maker. Apple, AMD, Nvidia, they all became TSMC's customers. By the late 2018, while Intel was still struggling to perfect its 10nm process, TSMC had already moved to 7nm, then 5nm. And they were mass-producing these chips faster, cheaper, and more reliably than Intel could even dream of. Then came geopolitics. As the US and China locked horns over technology, semiconductors became the center of a new Cold War. The US restricted China's access to advanced chips, while China doubled down on building its own semiconductor independence. Intel, stuck in the middle, faced huge pressure. On one hand, they were expected to be America's champion, to bring chip manufacturing back to US soil. On the other hand, they were losing ground globally to TSMC and Samsung, who had support from their governments and massive international demand. Put all of this together, and Intel wasn't just fighting rivals like AMD or Nvidia anymore, they were fighting policies. Here's the thing about Intel. A company this big doesn't just roll over and die. Even with all their missteps, they're still one of the most important names in tech. And in the last few years, they've been trying hard to stage a comeback. In 2021, Intel brought Pat Gelsinger back as CEO, a man who actually started his career as an Intel engineer decades ago. He's not just some corporate manager, he's someone who knows the company's DNA. And from day one, he started shaking things up. First, Gelsinger announced IDM 2.0, a bold plan to not just fix Intel's own chips, but to turn Intel into a foundry for other companies. That means instead of just making Intel processors, Intel would manufacture chips for whoever needed them, just like TSMC does. Second, Intel is investing massively in new factories. We're talking tens of billions of dollars to build cutting-edge fabs in Arizona. They're betting big that as governments realize the importance of domestic chip making, Intel will become the go-to partner. The US even passed the CHIPS Act, a $52 billion package to boost semiconductor manufacturing, and Intel is set to be one of its biggest beneficiaries. Third, Intel is trying to win back performance credibility. They launched new processor lines like Alder Lake and Meteor Lake, which finally started to close the gap with AMD and Apple Silicon. But there's a hidden problem. While Intel is moving fast now, the competition hasn't slowed down. TSMC is already working on 2nm. So the question is, are Intel's comeback moves too late? Or is this the beginning of a redemption story? So, what can we take away from the story of Intel? Honestly, it's bigger than just one company's fall. The first lesson: complacency kills. Intel had all the money, all the talent, and all the opportunities, but they got comfortable. They dismissed smartphones, ignored GPUs, and assumed their dominance in PCs would last forever. The second lesson: culture drives innovation. When Intel was led by Andy Grove, paranoia fueled progress. But when bureaucracy and arrogance took over, innovation slowed to a crawl. Culture is the invisible engine that decides whether a company rises or falls. The third lesson: the world doesn't wait. While Intel struggled with delays, TSMC, Samsung, and others raced ahead. Geopolitics and global rivalries don't pause for anyone, and if you're not at the cutting edge, you're already behind. But maybe the biggest lesson is this: even the giants can fall. Intel's story is a warning for today's tech titans: Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta. You can be on top of the world one year and fighting for relevance the next. And as for Intel, the story isn't finished yet. With new leadership, government backing, and billions of dollars in investment, they're fighting to write their comeback chapter. Will they succeed? Or will history remember them as the company that taught us how quickly power can slip away? One thing's for sure: in the tech world, you can never take tomorrow for granted.
And hey, if you made it this far, I've got a question for you. Do you think Intel can actually pull off a comeback? Or is it too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear where you stand on this. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on the notification bell. It really helps push this video out to more people who love tech stories like this.